I've done quite a lot of long exposure photography recently, and that's prompted a few people to reach out to me with a question about hot pixels. And I thought that might make for an interesting One Wednesday video, how to avoid, or if you can't avoid, get rid of hot pixels on long exposures. So that's what this video is. I hope you'll find it interesting. If you do and you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe before you go. Hi everyone, thanks for joining me for another One Wednesday. It's the extra video I put out one Wednesday every month when I cover topics that I think don't really fit into my normal weekly schedule. And today, as I said in the intro, the topic is hot pixels, which can appear during long exposures. They appear as kind of bright coloured spots, particularly when you zoom in to look at the detail on an image. They're caused by something called charge leak in the sensor, which happens when the sensor gets hot, which it will do during long exposures because it's working for a long period of time. It's made worse if you're doing multiple long exposures in a row, and it's also worse in hot conditions. So it's something that does happen to me occasionally. It's also made worse if you accidentally or deliberately underexpose the image and then recover a lot of detail from the shadow areas in post-processing. So if you boost the exposure and boost the shadows a lot, then that will make those hot pixels stand out a lot more. Now, there are some ways to completely avoid hot pixels in the field, in the photographic process. So I'll run through those first, and then we'll look at what you can do if you end up with hot pixels in the image back on the computer and a good way to get rid of them. Now, the first way you can get rid of hot pixels is actually in the camera. You can turn on your camera's long exposure noise reduction. And what this does is it takes your long exposure image and then immediately afterwards it takes another identical exposure but with the shutter closed. Now, because the shutter is closed, the image should be completely black. Anything which isn't completely black is long exposure noise and hot pixels. And in the camera, it will use that second image to do what's called a dark frame subtraction, which will basically take away all of those hot pixels and noise from the original image. It's pretty easy to do. Turn it on and shoot. The downside to it is that every time you shoot a long exposure, it takes twice as long. So if you're shooting a 4-minute exposure, it will take 8 minutes before the camera finishes working. May not be a problem if you're just hanging around waiting anyway, but if you're doing a long exposure panorama or a long exposure focus stack, that might be a bit of an issue. Now, there is another way to do this. You can do the dark frame subtraction in post-processing. To do this, you take your long exposure image or images, and then you put on a lens cap that blocks all of the light coming in, and you do one more exposure with exactly the same settings, same aperture, same exposure time, same ISO, same focal length and everything else. And what that will give you is a completely black frame, apart from the hot pixels and noise generated by the hot sensor. And you can then put that into Photoshop over your long exposure image, and by using the subtract mode, it will take those hot pixels and long exposure noise out. It's a very effective way of doing it. It does mean you have to do that one extra long exposure, which might be an issue time-wise if you're rushing to do something else, but less than it would be if you're doing multiple long exposures for a focus stack or a panorama. The other thing is it does involve a little bit of fiddling around. You've got to put a lens cap on that blocks all the light. So something like this is no good because it doesn't block all the light. And it might mean you've got to take your filters off and all of that sort of thing in the field. The third option is to break your long exposure down into a series of shorter exposures. So instead of doing one 4-minute exposure, you could do 8 30-second exposures or 16 15-second exposures, or more if you wanted to. And then you bring those into Photoshop and you use an average process in Photoshop. That will give you exactly the same effect as the long exposure, but it will in most cases pretty much remove hot pixels and long exposure noise in that averaging process. It also, as a side benefit, tends to increase the dynamic range of the image. So again, it's a very effective approach, providing you can still get the exposure time that you want. So if you're artificially darkening the scene to extend the exposure using filters, you could use a lighter filter to enable you to get shorter exposures. If it's a case that you're shooting in very dark conditions anyway, and that's why you're doing long exposures, you're probably going to have to increase the ISO quite a bit, which may not be ideal, but it may work out okay. It may be better to do that than shooting a long exposure with hot pixels in. So there's quite a few ways to avoid those hot pixels, but what if none of those ways really suit the way that you're shooting on the day? Here's an image that I shot a few weeks ago. It was early morning, it was dark, but it was also very, very warm. And this is a 4-minute exposure that I actually got wrong because I underexposed it by at least a stop. So I've had to increase the exposure and lift the shadows a lot. And if I zoom in to 100%, you can see there are loads of hot pixels down in this bottom area here. I got away with it pretty much everywhere else, but down here there's loads of them. Now, what I could do is I could use something like the spot healing brush and take each one out, and that probably wouldn't be too bad on this one, but it's a bit of a laborious process and not always the best way to do it. Normal noise reduction in Lightroom or even something like Topaz Denoise AI doesn't really do anything with this. So what I prefer to do is use in Photoshop the scratch and dust noise filter. So what I'll do is I'm going to create a duplicate layer to work on because I don't want to mess up my existing layer. I'm going to filter, noise, dust and scratches. Now I'm actually just going to pull everything back to the minimum at the moment. So that's a radius of 1 pixel and a threshold of 0. And it's actually already taken out some of those hot pixels. So if I click the preview off, you can see a load of them come back. Click it back on again, and a load of them have disappeared, but there's still a few remaining. So what I want to do is bring my radius up until the hot pixels completely disappear. Probably come back a little bit. So at a radius of 4, all of my hot pixels have disappeared, but it has had a detrimental effect on the sharpness, for example, in these rocks. Again, if I click preview off, you can see the hot pixels are back, but the sharpness is back in the rocks. If I click it back on again, it's quite soft in the rocks. So I'm going to do 2 things for that. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the threshold up. If I bring the threshold up probably a fair bit, a bit further, what I'm looking for is my hot pixels coming back, because that will give me the maximum threshold. And if you can see it, but they're just starting to appear again up here possibly difficult to see them on the video, but I can see the hot pixels appearing again at around 20, 21. So I'm going to put it back a bit below that, maybe to about 12, something like that. Hot pixels have gone, and that's brought back some of the sharpness in the rocks, but not all of it. But I'm going to apply that filter now. So that's got rid of my hot pixels, but at the cost of some sharpness in various places. In particular, if I go and look up here, if I take that layer off, make it invisible, you can see it's made a right mess of, oops, it's made a right mess of the background here. Take it back off again. So what we want to do is only apply that layer where we've got hot pixels. So I'm going to put a layer mask on, I'm going to put a black mask on, so I'll hold down the Option key, that would be Alt key on a PC. So that's now hidden that entire layer. I'm going to take a white brush, opacity at 100%, nice and soft, make it a bit bigger, and then I'm just going to brush in where those hot pixels appear. I will say this is a particularly bad example of hot pixels on my camera. I don't normally see them as bad as that. It was probably because I underexposed it, and that's what made a mess of it. So that's got rid of my hot pixels, but it's restored the sharpness into the rocks. There's a couple of little hot pixels in the rocks, so I can just brush that filter in just a little bit on there. And I probably want to go through the entire image and just look for any more hot pixels appearing. You know, there might be some, maybe if I brighten the sky a little bit, but it doesn't look like there's anything. They're star trails. But that looks like it's done a pretty good job of getting rid of my hot pixels and keeping the rest of the image the way I want it. So that's my video on hot pixels, how to avoid them, how to deal with them if you've got them. I hope you found it interesting. If you have, well, you know the routine. Likes, shares and comments all really appreciated. If you've enjoyed this, if you're interested in seeing what else I get up to and you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe before you go. I hope you'll join me for Saturday's video, which will be an in the field video. And finally, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch, so thank you very much. And until the next video, bye.